When collecting games, one of the first things you need to decide is what condition you want your games to be in. And the quick answer is good condition, of course, but what good condition means can vary from person to person, and the higher your standards are, the more difficult it can become. Not to mention, how complete your games need to be is important as well, with things like boxes, manuals, and original packaging all being potential factors. And as most collectors will tell you, when it comes to deciding these personal preferences, it's the sooner the better. Otherwise, you may look back and wish certain games you had were in a different condition, and then you gotta either try to replace them or just continue to feel that sinking, burning feeling of regret every day. For example, say you've got a Sega Genesis game. You've got the cartridge and you're pretty happy with it until one day you decide that just isn't good enough anymore, and you need to have the case and manual with it too. Well, now you gotta try to hunt down a case and manual for the game, which is going to be a lot harder to find than if you just bought the game complete to begin with. In fact, in these situations, I found it's almost easier to just sell your cartridge and then rebuy the game complete. Definitely a hassle that could have been avoided. What I typically see amongst collectors is that once they decide they need one game a certain way, they need to own all their games that way, at least when it comes to any given system. For example, once you decide you need to have every Sega CD game in its case with the manual, then you probably don't want any disc-only Sega CD games from that point on. Now, are there some collectors who don't follow these kinds of rules of uniformity? Yes, there sure are. These are what I like to call whatever I can get collectors. They're not as adamant about condition and completeness. And of course, there are people who fall somewhere in between these two extremes. Some collectors may not care about completeness so long as the cosmetic condition is good. When it comes to cartridge games, there's a few things to consider. Perhaps the biggest thing that's always going to be right front and center is the condition of the label, and there's a number of imperfections that you could run into. Little chunks could be missing, there could be writing on it, stickers, it could be peeling off a little bit, and it could even be discolored from sun fading. These issues can really vary between different types of cartridges as well. In my opinion, I've found NES and Super Nintendo stickers to typically be pretty easy to find in good condition, but where I've run into the most trouble is with Sega Genesis games, and specifically later cartridges that use the red labels. Sometimes what'll happen is the red label will actually fade to more of a pink, but perhaps even more curious are these black spots that will show up on some cartridges. Sonic 3 is actually notorious for this problem. Good luck finding a Sonic 3 cartridge that doesn't have this to some degree. This is the best one I could find, and I could swear that it's gotten worse the longer I've had it. So what the heck is this? Well, it's something people like to call Actiplaque, dating back to its notoriety of being found on old Activision Atari cartridges. But it's a result of a certain kind of glue being used combined with a thinner label. Pretty awesome, right? I haven't really noticed this issue with NES and Super Nintendo cartridges, but that doesn't mean those cartridges aren't prone to problems of their own. One of the issues stems from the fact that these cartridges are the color gray, and like most things that consisted of gray plastic during that time, that meant there was a chance it could turn to everybody's favorite nicotine yellowish brownish color. This is definitely most infamous for its association with the Super Nintendo console, but pretty much anything gray was prone to this. Heck, even all the way up to the Sega Dreamcast. Because NES games use a darker gray plastic, it can sometimes be harder to detect, and especially if you don't have it in hand and are going off of pictures on something like an eBay listing. The lighting in the pictures has to be really clean, or else it can be hard to tell. Plus, the front and back of the cartridge are actually two separate pieces of plastic screwed together, so you could end up having one piece with no yellowing at all, and another have a whole bunch. This problem goes for Super Nintendo games as well. One possible solution is to swap the back half of the cartridge out with another one that is clean, preferably off some shovelware title, but hold on a second. You see, Nintendo and Super Nintendo games have a sticker on the back of them, and they're not all the same, and in rare instances some Super Nintendo games even had the contents of the stickers imprinted into the plastic itself. these stickers will often get damaged as well, which may or may not matter to you. There's not a ton of different variations, so it's very possible to find a replacement match, but if you look really closely, there is a distinct imprint on every single one, typically a number that could possibly be followed by a letter if it was a revision of the game. And yes, believe it or not, these old games did have some revisions released, even if they were usually pretty minor changes and most people are completely unaware of them. Oh, and by the way, remember how we were picking on those poor Sega Genesis cartridges not too long ago? Well, they're the ones doing a celebratory dance now because they have black plastic that won't yellow and hides imperfections well, not to mention no sticker on the back that can get damaged. Of course, there are plenty of gray cartridges that never yellow, including Nintendo and Super Nintendo games, but perhaps even less likely to suffer yellowing would be Nintendo 64 cartridges. So what is the problem with Nintendo 64 cartridges, since, you know, it seems like every cartridge has a flaw? Well, N64 cartridges use some pretty cheap paper for their labels, which of course is more prone to damage. Then we have Game Boy games. You'll often find Game Boy games that have wear on them right where kids were probably impatiently pulling on them to remove them from the Game Boy. As a result, Game Boy games tend to be more beaten down than most. It's not a bad idea to buy games that were stored in these iconic cases, and while we're talking about it, both Nintendo and Super Nintendo games had some nice sleeves to help protect them as well. Okay, now it's time to talk about disc-based games, and I'd say this is a little more straightforward. For starters, most people want their CD games to include the case and manual. This seems to be the preference way more often than it is for cartridge-based games, since a game cartridge stands well on its own. A game CD by itself just can't really be displayed and has to be stored. A case is a nice way to store a disc, and the manual feels necessary since it often doubles as the cover art for the game. But perhaps the biggest thing to be concerned about with the disc-based games is the condition of the disc itself, and specifically with how scratched up it is. Typically, most collectors won't mind a few light scratches on their disc so long as the game still works, if perhaps for no other reason than just because it would be such a headache to try to make sure every single disc in your collection is scratchless. As I've mentioned before on this channel, having your discs resurfaced by a business with a professional machine is a great way to go. This can often leave discs looking brand new, and you gotta remember that discs are designed with a thick protective layer, so this protective layer can be resurfaced multiple times without getting anywhere near the data layer of the disc. When it comes to the manual, you'll often find these are in good condition since a lot of people probably never even bothered to look at them, though you should definitely keep in mind that sometimes they do have pages torn out or writing on them. They're also prone to water damage, which is easily identifiable by the warped, wavy effect it has on the paper. It's also worth mentioning that CD cases are prone to cracking, especially Sega Saturn and Sega CD cases, so be aware of that if it's something that bothers you. The smaller standard jewel cases can be easily replaced. Odds are you have some old music CDs or who knows what lying around, and you can just take these apart, they're made out of 3 pieces, and use them to replace your game cases. As for the Sega Saturn and Sega CD cases, yeah, these are far more unique cases that will be harder to replace, but I have started to see some options popping up for purchasing replacements. When it comes to the durability of cases for cartridge-based games, it's a different situation, though there are still some things to look out for. Nintendo games come in thin cardboard boxes that are very prone to wear and damage, and that's actually why I personally don't collect them, along with the demand for space they require. Though they remain very valuable collector items, especially in good condition, and there are little clear plastic cases you can buy that will help protect them. When it comes to Sega Genesis cases, often referred to as clamshells, these are often praised for their durability, especially compared to thin cardboard, but they still have their issues. For starters, I feel like for all the praise they get for durability, it's not uncommon to find them with at least one of their corners chipped off, the outside plastic sleeve torn. They often don't snap shut properly, and there's just something about removing a cartridge from one of these that doesn't feel right. It just requires a hell of a lot of force and seems like it could potentially scratch the plastic on the cartridge. Also, who are the a-holes that remove the plastic hang tabs off of these? I guess people find them to look out of place since they were designed for store shelves. People have their different preferences, I guess, and people have their different preferences when it comes to all things game collecting, whether it be which games you own, what condition they need to be in, or how complete they are. I hope this video was helpful in getting you to think about what your personal preferences are and why they're important to you. I'd love to hear any comments you may have in regards to what matters the most when you're adding games to your collection, or if perhaps you're one of those whatever I can get collectors I referred to earlier. This is something anybody who collects will think about, and I'm sure you'd have some interesting thoughts to share. So as always, leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird.